Welcome to Food Friends, a podcast inspiring home cooks to try new dishes in the kitchen by sharing trusted recipes, tips, and friendship. Hi, I'm Sonia.
And I'm Carrie. We met in Los Angeles over 15 years ago as personal chefs and haven't stopped talking about food since. We're so glad you're here.
Hi, Carrie.
Hi, Sonia. I really want to know, what was your best bite this week?
Carrie, my best bite was granola, which you make some of the best granola on the planet. You inspired the granola recipe I included in my cookbook called Carrie's Granola. One of the signature parts of your granola is that you make it with puffed cereal, things like puffed kamut, puffed millet, rice, in addition to oats and all the other good things like shredded coconut, nuts. I love that granola, but I had seen friends make buckwheat granola over the years where they take buckwheat groats, raw buckwheat. It has to be raw and not toasted, and there's a difference because they sell both. And that gets combined with oats or not into a granola. So I was like, I think I can kind of make my own version of this that's a little bit based on your granola, but a little bit based on some other granolas I've seen. So it is slightly different, but it's similar components. So you take your regular oats and you take your buckwheat, you combine those two, you add shredded coconut, which I think really helps in a granola. It kind of adds another stickiness and toastiness, don't you think? Like unsweetened shredded coconut.
Yeah, I think in any granola, I guess in my own preference of granolas, I like my granolas to be rich and fatty. So adding coconut is a must for me.
Yeah, and I like a clumpy granola. So whatever can make it like clumpy, I don't like it too loose. All right, then it's about a cup of nuts, and you can use any nuts you want. I did a mix of pecans and walnuts and pepitas. I love pepitas in my granola. Then I love to add seeds to my granola, so I added sesame seeds, which I think are just so nutty and rich on their own too, and hemp hearts, which I also really like. And you could do flax seeds, you could do chia seeds, but those are my preferences. And then the fat, you need fat in granola. My preferred fat is, I think, the same as yours, which is coconut oil.
I like coconut oil in some of my granolas, and I also like butter in others. I think this is also a place where butter really shines if you're willing to sort of cross over from the idea that granola is supposed to be mostly healthy.
I'm not mad at butter, but I prefer coconut oil when I'm making it at home, and olive oil works too. And so you take your coconut oil, and this is where you want to combine something sweet because you want to heat that coconut oil up, and you're basically making a syrup to coat everything. So I use honey. Sometimes I use maple syrup. Either work really well. And then you also can add a little sugar to the mixture itself, which you do too. You use turbinado sugar.
Yeah, the crunchier sugar.
Yeah. A few recipes that I read used coconut sugar, and I had some in my pantry. I was like, that's nice because it has kind of a brown sugar flavor.
Yeah,
and it's not as refined. Yeah. So I added coconut sugar to the mixture of seeds, nuts, oats, and grains. Then I melted my coconut oil with my honey, and I added some salt to that just to like season it up. You want salt. Yeah. I poured that over my granola, and then the last thing I added was an egg white, a beaten egg white, because I've just lately really liked adding egg white to my granola. It just makes it clump up better. I feel like nothing does it quite like that. But if you're vegan or plant-based, leave your egg white out. And then the other part of granola techniques is you don't want too hot of an oven. So I heat it to just 300. I smoothed everything out in a layer, and then I let it toast and get all cooked for about like 20 minutes. Then I stir it just once and put it back in for another 10 to 15 until it's pretty deeply golden brown. I like a really golden brown granola. Some people like it a little lighter. Are you more golden?
I like it more golden, as you know. It depends too on what you want out of your granola.
Yeah, it does. And so you take it out. You do not touch it. Do not disturb it. I, at this point, sprinkled a mix of dried fruit. I did a mix of some raisins and dried cherries and goji berries. I did not too much dried fruit, but I just sprinkled it on top, and the heat of the granola is going to plump up and soften that fruit. But if you put it in earlier to your granola, it burns and kind of gets hard. So you always want to add fruit at the end. And then I don't stir it. I don't do anything. I let it fully cool in the pan. And once it's fully, truly, fully cool, then I break it up, because then it's really gotten clumpy and stuck together.
I think there's so many incredible tips in this. I think that one is probably the biggest one is if you want your granola to have those like bites, almost like nuggets, you really want to let the whole thing cool without touching it. And I do think it's important to stir it once because that really helps more evenly brown things. I think that adding an egg white really helps bring that all together. And I think the other tip that I think sometimes people can overlook is if you're using coconut oil, you need to melt it. But if you're using something like olive oil, or even I sometimes use avocado oil, you don't have to melt it. But creating this uniform fat with sugar and a little bit of salt that then coats everything evenly really helps you get the most uniform flavor in your granola.
Absolutely. One thing I didn't mention is you can add spices. So I did add some cinnamon. You could do turmeric. You could do cardamom. You could do some mixture of like pumpkin spice seasoning if that's your jam. Sometimes I add vanilla. Once it's off the heat, that coconut oil, sugar, salt mixture, that's where I'll put in some vanilla paste. And then that buckwheat, it didn't have a strong flavor, but it had such a good texture. It's very, very crunchy. It's very, very nutty. It kind of almost just tasted like the nuts. And I've just been loving that for breakfast, and also been giving it to my neighbor. And
yeah, I was going to say,
yeah,
who did you share that granola with? Because I feel like it's great for breakfast, but there's only so much of it you can eat. So I always find myself sharing it with other people. But one of the things that I love about you using buckwheat is that if you're using buckwheat and if you're also using a gluten-free oatmeal, you have a completely gluten-free granola as well, which some people really need. And
well, this goes to your question, which is who am I giving it to?
Did you give it to your mom?
No, actually, I have a friend whose father passed away, and they're sitting Shiva. And sitting Shiva is a ritual mourning in the Jewish tradition, and people can come and visit during that time. It's like a week-long time, and there's times that are allocated to people coming. The family, one of the kids has an allergy to wheat, to dairy, to gluten, to a number of things. And I was like, oh, all the meals in the meal train, the dinners were covered. And I was like, but I wonder, no one's bringing them breakfast or a snack. And I was like, this is perfect because I know their kid can eat this. I think they'll really like it. I'm going to bring some kind of fruit maybe to go with it. I'm trying to think what else I can bring with the granola, but I'm going to go over there later today to drop that off.
That's so thoughtful of you to think about that, because I think whenever there's a meal train and whenever someone's experiencing a loss like that, it's always like, well, what are they going to eat? There's bagels, there's salads, there's casseroles, there's all kinds of those things. But people often overlook something like breakfast, which is really the way you start your day. So what a thoughtful thing.
Well, and I know you would do the same, or you'd bring your breakfast cookies, which are so good. Well, Carrie, I want to know what your best bite of the week was.
It's actually also a sweet. One of our closest friends, my friend Gary Gupta, it was his birthday. We wanted to celebrate him with a meal. And so I decided to make swamp soup, which is a soup that we recently talked about. And I wanted to and I made a loaf of bread. I actually made pita bread as well. So I gave them some pitas and I gave them a loaf of bread and some soup. But then I also wanted a dessert, and I sort of was running out of time. So I asked my husband to make brownies, and we found this really great and really easy brownie recipe online. As you know, I do make this Nigella Lawson recipe for brownies that I've been making for many years. And they're less brownie and more super fudgy. My clients used to call them mud brownies, almost like a flourless chocolate cake. And what I don't get in my brownie recipe that I use from Nigella Lawson is that crispy layer that you get if you buy a brownie box mix, right?
I feel like we talked about brownies in one episode. I am always still hunting for the best brownie, and there's a couple that have come close for me. But I remember us talking about the Nigella brownie and you being like, yeah, it's the recipe I use, but I don't think it's the best one out there because it's a little cakey. It's not just that
it's
recipe.
It's a little cakey and it's very fudgy, and it doesn't have that like
shattery top that you want in a brownie.
No, and I grew up eating brownie mixes, and I like a chewy brownie that has
Yeah.
that glossy top on it. And so this ended up being an excellent version of that. And it was also very simple. It has a lot of great instructions. You basically melt your butter and you add sugar. What's great about it too is that you use cocoa powder. You don't use melted chocolate, which again is like a lot of brownie recipes really want you to melt the chocolate. This is you sort of do it all in the same pan. So you melt your butter, you add your sugar, you add your cocoa powder, you stir that together. You let that sit for like 10 minutes. And while because then you're going to add your eggs to that one by one.
Oh.
And they give you a lot of great instructions. My husband is still a new cook, and he is getting really good at making like pastas and sheet pan meals, but baking is not really his strength. And so he really followed the instructions. You add the eggs one at a time, you work them in, and then you add the flour, and it only calls for a half a cup of flour. And so with like all this butter and all this cocoa powder and just a little bit of flour, they're incredibly fudgy and rich. And one of the other great tips that they give you is that you line your 8x8 brownie pan with parchment paper, which really helped us get them out of the pan and get them cooling so that we could get them cut and take them with us to our lunch to give to our friend. And we saved a couple of the little edges and ate them after dinner that night. And it's an excellent brownie recipe, I gotta say.
Yeah, actually, one of my favorite brownie recipes is a cocoa powder based recipe. And I think that recipe is really easy too, but one of the techniques is stirring the brownie batter a lot. Does this recipe call for that?
It calls for that. And you really only need a wooden spoon. You need a skillet to melt your butter. You need a wooden spoon, and you also need like a brownie pan, but you could use a pie plate if you wanted to. You could use any number of vessels, but this is one of those things that needs very little equipment.
And I do think there's something about the absence of the melted chocolate that helps with the texture. And the cocoa powder, especially if you're using a good cocoa powder, it has enough chocolate flavor. I think we think fancier is better, but I do think with brownies, simpler is best. And I love that James made this and that it's easy enough for a beginner baker to make. So we'll definitely link the recipe as well as the granola recipe. And we also send out recipes every week on our Substack. So make sure to subscribe to that. We always link the Substack in our show notes along with every recipe on the show. And we also send out original recipes every Sunday. So definitely look out for that too.
Yes. Okay, until next time.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for being our food friend.
If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe, leave us a review, and share this episode with friends. We love hearing from you, so follow us on Instagram or drop us a line at foodfriendspodcast.com.
Yes, we'd love to hear from you and your food friends. Happy cooking and eating.